Thank you everyone for coming. Can you hear in the back? Yeah, it's, the fan is louder for me than it may be for some of you back there. So if I start to speak too loudly, then it may be that I can't hear myself speak, which may not be a bad thing. So I was given a charge of talking about the Iran deal and what it means. But at the time that the invitation was sent, there was still a lot of uncertainty as to how the deal would fare in Congress and whether the Republicans would be able to recruit enough Democrats, especially from the Senate, to be able to cause a crisis for the president and for all the other countries in the international community that have been part of reaching this deal with Iran about the future of its nuclear program. Thankfully, that crisis has ebbed somewhat. As you may have seen in the last few days, Senator Casey and Senator Coons and today Senator Booker from New Jersey have all expressed their support for the deal. And that means that the last time I looked, there is now 35 senators who have come out publicly that they will oppose a vote of disapproval of the deal that the Republicans are trying to pass. And therefore, the president now should have a veto-proof coalition that will mean that this deal will go forward if all goes well. And since so many of you have been involved in trying to make this possible in terms of, calling and writing and meeting with elected officials, I won't go into the details of the deal, because at one level, the details don't matter. If you look to see the reasons that people gave for supporting the deal, by and large, it's about a larger politics at play, not about how many centrifuges Iran may have and by what year those centrifuges may increase in number or capacity. So let me focus on some of the bigger picture issues that I think are important in terms of learning some political lessons about how we got here and exactly what here means in terms of the deal and its larger significance. Let me talk about what this means for the larger Middle East and its future. And lastly, what it means for the risk that nuclear weapons pose in the world more broadly and not just in the Middle East. Because all of these things are connected together in important ways. And a lot of this has been missing from the discussion about the deal in the last 2 months since it was agreed in July. So the first thing I want to talk about is, how did we get here? In the sense of not just the deal, but why did we need a deal? And why did we need a deal now? And it's a very interesting story that if you read the newspapers, you would not know. And the story begins, as it should, with the American overthrow of an elected government in Iran. Right? They had an elected government. They wanted to nationalize Iranian oil and take it away from the British and American companies that were dominating it. And the United States and Britain organized a coup and overthrew the elected government of Prime Minister Mossadegh of Iran and brought into power the Shah of Iran, who was America's best friend in the Middle East. And for several decades, the Shah was ruthless, repressive, tyrannical, and basically a monster by any reasonable measure of politics in modern life. But he was our monster, right? And the United States had the largest American embassy in the world in Iran. And we sold him lots of weapons. And in the 1970s, the Shah decided that he too wanted a nuclear program, because nuclear energy was all the rage in the early 1970s. They were building lots of nuclear power plants in the United States, in Europe, in Japan, and the Shah said, well, I have lots of money, I want some. And some of you may remember that the United States in the early 1970s was led by none other than Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger. And Kissinger thought this was a fantastically good idea, because we would sell the Shah all the nuclear technology he could possibly afford and get our hands on his oil money, which we were also getting by selling him weapons as well. But the more you can get, the better. So they said, of course you can have nuclear energy. You can have lots and lots of nuclear energy, and we will sell it to you. And we will sell you not just nuclear power plants, but we will allow you to have and help you develop the technology to make enriched uranium, to make fuel for your nuclear power plants, and the technology to separate plutonium from the spent nuclear fuel after it comes out of the reactor, because we were going to do that too. And this was what the future of nuclear technology was supposed to look like. And this was going to make billions and billions and billions of dollars for the United States nuclear industry. And then the Shah said publicly, oh yeah, I'm going to make nuclear weapons too. And the US said, okay, we won't talk about that. How much nuclear energy do you want? In other words, we didn't care that he was talking about nuclear weapons, as long as he was our monster and willing to buy our nuclear technology. To the point where the Shah said, I have no nuclear engineers. And the US said, oh, you can send them to MIT. I can say this because I'm at Princeton, not MIT. So he said, oh, you can send them to MIT. MIT said, yeah, we'll have them happily. And so the Iranian government paid lots of young Iranians to come to MIT to study nuclear engineering. And the idea was that they would go back and set up this nuclear industry in Iran, and they would have lots of American friends and buy American technology, and everybody would be happy. But the key point was that when he talked about lots of nuclear energy and uranium enrichment and plutonium and nuclear weapons, it was okay. And then the revolution happens in 1979. And it's not okay anymore. And for a while, the Iranians actually stopped their nuclear program altogether. Ayatollah Khomeini didn't like nuclear energy very much. He said, this is a waste of our time and money, we don't need it. But time passed, and eventually the Iranians said, okay, we should finish our nuclear plans. Let's at least build one nuclear reactor. And one reason, in part, was all these American-trained nuclear engineers who had come back and wanted something to do. Right? I mean, you spent your whole life preparing for this, and your government doesn't want to do it, so you give them a bit of a push. And so the Iranians resumed their nuclear program, but because it was the Islamic Republic, the United States was very unhappy. The US allies were very unhappy. And as a consequence, the Iranians couldn't get anybody to help them. And so eventually they turned to the Russians, and the Russians helped them build the Bushehr nuclear power plant. But all these American-trained nuclear engineers, including the guy who happens now to be the head of the Atomic Energy Organization of Iran and negotiated the nuclear deal, got his PhD at MIT. They also wanted the uranium enrichment and all the other stuff that they had once hoped that they would get. And so Iran launched a secret part of their nuclear program. So the above ground part, the public part, was the Russians helping them build a nuclear reactor to make electricity. And the quiet part was the uranium enrichment program, the centrifuges that spin the uranium gas to turn it from the natural uranium that we get out of the ground into the enriched uranium you can use as fuel to power the reactor, or that if you keep enriching it, you can use to make nuclear weapons material. And there's some evidence that the Iranians, or at least some Iranians, had nuclear weapons ambitions. That, you know, why not? In 2003, we all got to learn that the Iranians actually had this secret program. became public. And so there was a big international crisis. What is Iran doing? They're secretly trying to make a bomb, etc. And so the Iranians came to the world and said, look, let's make a deal, right? We will suspend all our nuclear activities, including our uranium enrichment and everything else, and figure out what the future of our nuclear program should look like if you accept the fact that we're entitled to have a nuclear program. And the lead negotiator at that time was a guy called Hassan Rouhani, who is now the president of Iran. But at that time, the Iranians managed to have negotiations with the British, the French, and the Germans, and convinced them that Iran would limit itself to 164 centrifuges and do no more enrichment of uranium until we could resolve diplomatically this issue about their nuclear program. So they were going to suspend all of their nuclear activities at a very low level, way short of anything you would need to make a nuclear weapon, in exchange for international negotiations on a deal to resolve the world's concerns about Iran. So the British agreed, the French agreed, the Germans agreed with the Iranians. Okay, we can do this. You suspend your nuclear program, and we can have diplomacy about what to do next. And the Bush administration said, absolutely not. Absolutely not. The Iranians can't have any nuclear activity. Suspension is not an option, zero. Right? You can't have any nuclear capability of any kind whatsoever. You are part of the axis of evil, nothing. So the first shot we had at a deal 12 years ago, the Bush administration killed it. And instead they imposed sanctions on Iran. They took Iran to the United Nations Security Council and put more sanctions on Iran. And so the Iranians said, okay then, we will do it the hard way. So the Iranians went from 164 centrifuges to 19,000 centrifuges, which is what they had until we got to this deal. Okay? And they built themselves all kinds of nuclear capability, including a new second enrichment facility buried deep under a mountain, just in case somebody wanted to attack it. And so by the time we got to President Obama coming into office, he said, look, I'm willing to talk to the Iranians. But the Iranians were being led by President Ahmadinejad, who thought the West was the great Satan and was not to be negotiated with. And so when Washington wanted to talk, the Iranians didn't want to talk. And then eventually, in 2013, the Iranians had an election. Hassan Rouhani, the previous nuclear negotiator, became the president of Iran. He said, I am ready to negotiate. And within a few months, we had the first deal between Iran and the international community. So it took a change of political leadership in both places to make this deal happen. And the deal was agreed between Iran on the one side and what's called the P5+1, which is the United States and the other permanent members of the Security Council, Russia, Britain, France, and China, plus Germany. And so they first made a deal where Iran would suspend its nuclear activities and there would be agreement on, let's make a deal. But while we're making the deal, you don't do any more nuclear stuff. And the Iranians said, okay, as long as you're sincere about diplomacy, we can do this. So we had the first deal. Then we had a second deal where they agreed on what should be in the final deal, the framework agreement. And then in July, they finally reached a deal. This has been an enormous diplomatic undertaking. I mean, no one can think of anything similar to this that has taken up so much diplomatic energy from the great powers in the world system over such a long time on one issue to try and reach agreement. And they have finally reached agreement. And the United Nations Security Council has unanimously approved and accepted this agreement. Unanimously. And so what we're seeing now and what we've all been struggling with is the weird fact that the only real debate about this deal still in the world is here. And it's because of the Republicans in particular, and the political power of Israel and its allies in the United States in being able to intervene in helping shape the foreign policy of the United States. But in between the saga of missed opportunities and the need of political change to actually make diplomacy work, it has worked, right? The Iranians, who have every reason not to trust the United States, were willing to trust the Obama administration and the other countries in the world to be sincere in diplomacy and make a deal and stick to it. So they said, okay, we're willing to make a deal with you. The Obama administration was willing to make a deal with a country that the previous administration had demonized as part of the axis of evil. And the rest of the world just wanted to move on. And what the deal has done is agreed a set of long-term restraints on Iran's nuclear activities in exchange for a lifting of the sanctions that have been imposed. And the deal will last, different parts of it last for different periods of time, as you all know. Some parts last for 10 years, some for 20, some for 25, some will last beyond 25. The issue that we have now is that we've gotten here, but to take the deal to the 35 senators that have lined up with the administration now, and hopefully the more that will line up in the coming weeks before we actually get to voting in Congress, the deal has a dark side. And the dark side is on both sides. The dark side on the Iranian side is that the Iranian nuclear establishment has managed to hijack policymaking in Iran by insisting that no, all of these different parts of our nuclear program have to stay intact for 10 years, 25 years, etc., because we want to have nuclear energy for the future and build lots of nuclear power plants and have all of this stuff, as if nuclear energy is still a good idea. Okay? This is 1970s MIT thinking, right? I mean, the rest of the world has learned a lot from 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl and Fukushima. The Germans are planning to shut down all their nuclear power plants. Lots of countries never even got into the business of nuclear energy, but the Iranian nuclear leadership has managed to convince their political leadership that no, you have to bet the future of your country on nuclear energy, as if there are so many more important things that the future of Iran could actually depend on. So that's one problem, because it means that once you have nuclear capability to make nuclear energy and reactors, etc., you will always have the capability to make nuclear weapons. Okay? It's just the way it is. And that shouldn't scare you, because you have to remember that it's the 70th anniversary of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. It took the United States 4 years to make the first atomic bombs, and no one knew anything about nuclear technology when they started, at all. No one had ever made a nuclear reactor. No one had ever enriched uranium. No one had any idea how any of this stuff was ever supposed to work. It was a bunch of calculations by some physicists. And in 4 years, they went from nothing to making bombs that destroy entire cities. If you could do that between 1940 and 1945, you think we can't do it 70 years later, and that anybody can't do it if they put their mind to it? And the more nuclear technology you have, more capabilities you have, the shorter that time becomes. So that's the dark side on the Iranian side. The dark side on the United States side of this deal is that to sell this deal to the American people and to all these reluctant Democratic Party senators and members of the House, the Obama administration has struck a Faustian bargain. And the bargain is that to sell the deal, they have compounded the militarization of the Middle East and the militarization of American policy. So to sell diplomacy, you've actually strengthened militarism. Let me explain. So how many of you have read President Obama's letter to Congressman Nadler from New York? You should read it. How many of you have read President Obama's letter to Senator Coons? You should definitely read that. How many of you have read Senator Kerry's letter to members of the Senate and to the House? 1, 2, 3, 4. So these are really important letters for you to read and to understand how the political process behind the scenes of this deal has actually worked. While people like us have been going to members of our communities, to the media, to our elected officials, and talking about why nuclear weapons are bad, war is bad, we need diplomacy, and we need to have a settlement and lift sanctions and make progress and have peace in the Middle East. The Obama administration has been telling the senators and the members of Congress that we will pour more military aid and more weapons into the Middle East forever. So you can support the deal, because Iran will be put into a box and surrounded by countries backed by the United States who will be armed even more than they already are today. So in explaining what the deal means for the security of Israel, the president has said that, and this is from his letter, that since 2009, the United States has given $20.5 billion in direct military aid to Israel. Right? That's about $3 billion a year. It's about $8 million a day. $8 million a day just in direct military aid. This is 20% of the Israeli military budget. What the Israelis do from now on, we are paying 1/5 of that. 1 out of every 5 bullets is paid for by us. On top of this 20.5 billion, there is another 3 billion that has gone to Israeli missile defense programs like the Iron Dome to stop rockets, which doesn't actually work very well, but that's a separate issue. Plus, Obama takes great pride in this in his letter. He says, I have just authorized $1.9 billion of new money for, and I quote, munitions resupply to Israel to allow them to, and I quote, replenish inventories. Why would the Israelis need to replenish their inventories? The Gaza war of last year. We are now paying for every bullet and rocket and shell that the Israelis fired and killed 2,000 people in Gaza. Because they used it up, so we're going to give them some more. So they're not short for next time. This is how he is selling this deal to the senators and the congressmen. So you think, well, you know, give or take, it's $25 billion. That's a lot. And then he says, then there are our Gulf Arab friends, the Saudis, the United Arab Emirates, and so on. Since 2009, the United States, according to the president, has sold them $129 billion worth of weapons. 7 years, $129 billion worth of weapons. He says, and we're going to sell them some more so that they will be strong against Iran. All of these countries, the Gulf Arab states and Israel, their military spending far exceeds anything that the Iranians spend on their military. Already, the Americans have given them state-of-the-art American weapons. The Iranians have been sanctioned for so long, they're still flying planes from the 1970s, provided by the United States. And yet, to sell this deal as a victory of diplomacy, the biggest selling card is the fact that we're going to sell even more weapons to our friends so they can be militarily even stronger against Iran. So what does this mean for the future of the Middle East? The first is, of course, that it consolidates the role of the United States as the military power in the region, because Israel and the other states in the region will continue to depend on American military aid, assistance, and weapons for the foreseeable future, just as they have done for so many years in the past. And it's fundamentally a military relationship that is at play here. It also leaves Israel as the only nuclear-armed state in the region. How many times was it mentioned in the last 2 months that Israel has almost 100 nuclear weapons? You know, it didn't figure as part of the debate. I mean, the obvious answer in all of this debate about Iran making nuclear weapons was to deal with the threat of nuclear weapons in the Middle East and the whole world. That was never a talking point for the administration. It also serves a purpose that in all of these countries where billions of dollars of American military aid and weapons are flowing in, who is going to become the strong political players in those countries? The guys who have access to the American money and weapons. And on the Iranian side, you can imagine the debate that will be had in Iran. The Iranian generals will turn to President Rouhani and say, look, you see, you've got a deal. And now the Americans are arming everybody to the teeth. We need more weapons. All this money that is coming by lifting sanctions, you have to give it to us. Never mind feeding the poor and building schools and boosting the economy. We need weapons. Go buy weapons. Let us make weapons. Everybody else in the neighborhood is getting weapons. We need weapons too. You've created the perverse outcome that out of diplomacy, you've actually strengthened the hands of the military factions in Iran, who will take what little sanctions relief may be coming forward and given them a strong impulse to push their government to say, don't use the money that we get from sanctions relief for economic development and social improvement. We need to arm ourselves against all these new people with weapons supplied by the United States. The other things the deal doesn't do for the region is that it does nothing to resolve the issue of Palestine. It was never mentioned. It's as if it didn't exist. It's all about the security of Israel and the threat from Iran and the need to save the Arabs. Never the Palestinians. Not once was it mentioned, and it's not there in the letters from the President or the Secretary of State. It's as if they have disappeared altogether as part of what the Middle East means. And given this new security relationship, and the President has promised a 10-year new arrangement on military aid to Israel at current rates, $3 billion a year, you're not going to see much effort in the next year or so of the Obama administration to help make progress on the issue of Palestine. And what's worse is that, and you think, well, what could be worse? And I'll tell you what's worse. What's worse is in none of this debate has there been any discussion of, well, we could work with the Iranians to help resolve the civil war in Iraq, the endless tragedy that is unfolding in Syria, or the terrible stuff that is happening in Yemen. I mean, you've seen the pictures of the refugees coming to Europe from these war zones, especially from Syria. And it was never mentioned. All the administration is doing is telling Congress, oh, the Iranians are stirring up trouble in Iraq and in Syria and supporting Hamas and supporting Hezbollah. Well, all of that may be true. They're not the only ones stirring up trouble in all of those places. So are the Saudis, so is the UAE, so are the Israelis, so are the people in those countries themselves, so is the United States. But we could work together to solve this problem. But the idea of using this diplomacy as a stepping stone to solving these problems in the Middle East is not there. It's all about Iran is over there. We're going to lock them in a box, inspect them, and surround them with countries armed to the teeth to make sure they stay in their box. And from the Iranian point of view, what's the incentive then to cooperate in solving all of these problems in the region? And the biggest problem for the long term may well be the nuclear problem, because the Saudis and the Egyptians and others are talking about, well, once this deal is done, we want the same nuclear capabilities that the Iranians will one day have. So the Saudis are signing deals to one day buy nuclear power plants. The Egyptians are signing deals to one day buy nuclear power plants. The United Arab Emirates has already bought some. And what's been missing from this is a discussion of the idea of the United States putting its weight behind the effort to agree a Middle East zone that is free of nuclear weapons. Now, this is a very old idea, a nuclear weapon-free zone for the Middle East. It was actually first floated in 1974 by Iran and Egypt. That, look, we should just deal with the nuclear danger in the Middle East by all the countries of the region agreeing with each other never to make nuclear weapons. And Israel had nuclear weapons. The Israelis said, no way are we going to join anything like that. The United Nations kept passing resolutions in favor of it, and the United States would keep blocking them, and so there would be no progress. Until 1995, when the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the countries that have signed it meet every 5 years to talk about how much progress the treaty has made in reaching its goals. And one of its goals is the abolition of nuclear weapons. But in 1995, it was a special conference because when the treaty came into force in 1970, there was an agreement that after 25 years, all the signatories would meet and decide if they wanted to keep the treaty or not. Okay? So it had a lifetime built into it. And the options were that after 25 years, you could agree to keep it, you could change it, or you could scrap it. So when 1995 came, 25-year conference happens, and the question is, should we keep it, change it, or scrap it? The United States and all of its allies said, absolutely, we have to keep it, because it's what stops other countries from getting nuclear weapons. And other countries said, yeah, but the part of the treaty that says you have to give up your nuclear weapons, you haven't done it. You've had 25 years to keep your side of this treaty. You haven't done it. Why should we keep this treaty? And eventually the United States and the other nuclear weapon states and their allies decided that, you know, stopping other people from making nuclear weapons was really so important that they used a lot of pressure, not just nice diplomacy, to get countries to agree. But one of the concessions they had to make to get countries to agree to keep the treaty forever was that they agreed that there should be a Middle East nuclear weapon-free zone. Okay? So they said, okay, we agree that there should be a Middle East zone free of nuclear weapons. And then nobody did anything because the treaty was extended forever. The United States and the other countries with nuclear weapons got what they wanted. They got what they wanted. They walked away, said, thank you very much. And then in 2010, you know, they meet every 5 years. So they kept meeting every 5 years. Nothing happened. And in 2010, they agreed, again, because of a lot of pressure and because of President Obama, that they would have a conference to talk about the idea of a zone in the Middle East free of nuclear weapons. Not negotiate, but a conference to talk about the idea. And that this would happen by 2012. It didn't happen. And people were very unhappy. And the reason it didn't happen is the Israelis said, we're not happening, we're not letting it happen. The Americans said, well, okay, then it's not going to happen. So this year, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty countries met again in New York. I was there, as I'm sure some other people here were. And they couldn't even agree a final statement. It was that bad. And one of the biggest reasons was, why has there been no progress on a Middle East zone free of nuclear weapons? I mean, we've had all this diplomacy with Iran, we've had all this. Why haven't you made progress on this? And so everybody agreed on a final statement, except, yep, the United States, Britain, and for some reason, Canada. The only three countries that said, nope, we will not agree to the final statement, and the rule is by consensus, no statement. So they blocked it, And they blocked it, saying, you know, we don't want to talk about a Middle East zone free of nuclear weapons. That's all there is to it. So what we have now is that the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty is in crisis. Okay? All the countries of the world are on one side saying we want to talk about nuclear disarmament, and especially the Middle East free of nuclear weapons, and the United States and Britain and Canada, and I'm sure a few other allies who weren't willing to speak up at the time, saying, no, we're not going to talk about this. So what does this mean for the future of Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and the whole regime of trying to control the spread of nuclear energy and the risks it poses in terms of countries in making nuclear weapons? We don't know yet, right? But it looks really bad, because the last time there wasn't a consensus, and it's happened before, this is not the first time. The last time it happened was under President Bush, because they didn't believe in treaties. Yeah? They said, treaties, United Nations, blah, blah, forget it. And it was bad for a few years. Nobody would cooperate on anything. And so we may see a situation where countries are very unhappy with the United States and others about not being serious. And what makes it worse on top of that is that there is no negotiations between the United States and Russia on their nuclear weapons, right? Which you can't blame entirely on President Obama. Right? Putin has something to do with it. But the United States and Russia between them still have about 14,500 nuclear weapons. There are only 15,500 nuclear weapons in the whole world. Everybody else that has nuclear weapons between them has 1,000. The United States and Russia between them have the other 14,500. And so if we're going to make progress on reducing nuclear weapons and one day getting rid of them, it still has to be the United States and Russia that move forward. And there are no talks. There is no prospect of talks. No one sees any sign that the United States and Russia will reach agreement in the near future on cutting their nuclear weapons. If anything, what they see is the United States modernizing its nuclear weapons, the Russians modernizing their nuclear weapons, the British trying to decide about modernizing theirs, the French are in the middle of modernizing theirs, the Chinese are parading theirs. So, and the Indians and the Pakistanis are still making theirs, as are the Israelis and the North Koreans. So from the rest of the world's point of view, the prospect of nuclear disarmament has moved way beyond the horizon. And I'll tell you how far it's moved beyond the horizon in Washington, D.C. When he made his Prague speech a few years ago, President Obama said that he believed in a world free of nuclear weapons. He said, it may possibly not happen in my lifetime, but possibly means it possibly might. And he's what, 50-ish. So, you know. Hillary Clinton, who is running to be the next Democratic president of the United States, when she was Secretary of State, gave a speech in the State Department in which she said that, oh yeah, a world free of nuclear weapons, very important. We may get there in some century. So from Obama's lifetime to in some century. John Kerry, who replaced her as Secretary of State, he made a speech in which he said, oh yeah, it's a good idea, nuclear weapon-free world. At the rate we're going, it'll be however many centuries before we get there. So in other words, forget it. No one is going to make the diplomatic effort to make progress on this issue. So what's the rest of the world supposed to think? They promise not to make nuclear weapons in exchange for the countries with nuclear weapons giving them up. And it's not going to happen at this rate. So we have a very large crisis looming. So let me end with two observations. And the two observations are this. One is that the deal is a lot better than where we were in terms of finding a path forward to settle really, really hard, difficult disputes between countries. Diplomacy worked, but it took a huge amount of political will and political effort to get there. And for that, credit needs to go to the people who made it happen, and that includes the president of Iran and of the United States, as well as the other countries that were part of the negotiations. The second thing, though, is that what's really made the deal what it is in terms of getting it to Congress is that the effort to block it has failed because American people, by and large, and the peace movement in particular, were not willing to go down the road to war. They were not scared into opposing this deal, and enough people were willing to make the effort to make democracy work, to call their congressmen, talk to staff, send emails, and say, look, this is what democracy looks like. You are making a decision. I'm a constituent. This is what I want. And they have listened. The third thing, though, is that we're making a mess of it by selling the deal in terms of military security and not dealing with the real issues that need to be settled in the Middle East and with regard to nuclear weapons worldwide. But what the deal does is it gives us 10, 15, 20 years to try and make progress. Right? Because what we can do is we can make the argument, look, the Iranians have promised to behave themselves for 10 years. Let's try and make the world a much better place in that time so that by the end of it, they will not want even to think about making nuclear weapons, because no one will want to think about making nuclear weapons by, not in the Middle East, by making progress in a Middle East free of nuclear weapons, and by reducing our own nuclear weapons and not modernizing them so that people will see that the day is coming when nobody wants nuclear weapons at all. So this is our challenge now, right? That we have bought time and space. But the politics around this deal are not the politics we would have liked. So it's our job to make it right. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. A couple of things first, and we'll go on to questions and answers. The washrooms are up on the second floor. There's also food and refreshments out here for those who haven't yet partaken of them. And I also wanted to ask, is Mary Lou Hackett here? Can you, do you want to speak to what's going on in terms of FCNL's strategy around the agreement? I mean, and also what citizens can do to, or non-citizens too, for that matter. But
right. So I'm a member of Lehigh Valley Monthly Meeting and one of Philadelphia Yearly Meeting's representatives to FCNL, nominated by the Yearly Meeting to do that. So not a staff person, just a volunteer. It's not always that we have such an opportunity to really feel the effect of citizen activity with our politicians. And so it just so happened that in this deal, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Delaware were all really strong state players. And so the effort to be politically active here and your efforts to call and contact your congressional senator, your congressmen and particularly senators, made a difference, made a big difference. And if you know anyone in Maryland, if you're from Maryland and you know, or you have friends or family in Maryland, we still need to reach Senator Cardin. So you can let folks know, please contact Senator Cardin, please ask Cardin to support the deal. So that's a local piece for us. And then I think the other piece is just very pursuant to what we just heard, we all need to stay involved. Relationships with our congressional people, FCNL believes are long-term. You don't just go on an issue and disappear tomorrow. You establish a relationship, you establish yourself as a credible person and a person with a deep moral conviction. You make that really clear and you show up again and again and again. So please plan to keep showing up and keep writing and keep visiting, and we'll try to build, keep building on something. Thank you so much for your talk and your leadership.
thank you. One other thing, there is a sign-up sheet on the table. Consider it a kind of exit fee, as that if you could put your name and address and emails and addresses and other particulars. So we're open to questions from the floor. Over here. Okay.
Thank you. Recently, the United States had some of its personnel infect with a computer virus, the Iran nuclear computer system. How possible is it for a disgruntled Iran insurgent or a disgruntled Iran terrorist to infect the same computer system with a virus that could cause a meltdown in Iran of a computer-controlled stockpile, an act of sabotage in the nation inside of its own government, in its nuclear refining?
I'm not sure what nuclear system you have in mind. A few years ago, there was a case where the Americans and the Israelis together created a computer virus called Stuxnet. And this was a computer virus that was designed to get into the machinery that controlled Iran's centrifuges that enrich uranium at their facility in Natanz. And the centrifuges are basically long metal cylinders which have uranium gas in them, and they spin very fast and separate out the isotopes of uranium so that you can take out the enriched part and use it to make fuel for a nuclear power plant, or, as I mentioned, if you enrich it a lot, you can use it to make nuclear weapons. But that to make them centrifuges spin really fast, they have electric motors. And so this computer virus was designed to get into the electric motor control system and start changing the speed of the motor, but in a way that the operator couldn't tell by looking at the controls what the speed of the motor was. So they thought the motor is spinning at normal speed, and actually the motor was speeding up and slowing down and speeding up and slowing down. And eventually that makes the centrifuges break down. Sometimes they explode into pieces. And this destroyed quite a few Iranian centrifuges. And so the US and the Israelis were very pleased with themselves. Well, I mean, at the same time, you know, the Israelis, we believe, were killing Iranian scientists. So there was a determined effort in a variety of ways to try and attack the Iranian nuclear program. But the Iranians figured out what was going on. And some of them were trained at MIT after all. And they figured out how to isolate the motors and the centrifuges. And they got them back up and running, and then started building more. And the next viruses, you know, didn't have the effect because they learned what was going on. And so we know about this virus because it spread out of Iran to computers and motors of the same kind elsewhere in other countries, like viruses do. And so suddenly people started to think, where did this virus come from? And so we traced it back and figured out what it was. But it took a huge, determined technological effort by really smart people in Israel and the United States, including building a replica of Iranian centrifuges and motors and control systems to figure out exactly how the virus would work and make sure that it would do what it was supposed to do. So the idea of some, you know, person by themselves creating a virus that would bring down a nuclear reactor or something like that is very, very hard to imagine. You know, it takes a huge technological structure with lots of people and access to lots of hardware to test out your virus, make sure it does what it's supposed to do and not something else. So it's by no means a straightforward matter.
Over here.
I think all of us would support the idea of a nuclear-free Middle East, but none of us, I think, at least in the current envisionment, think that Israel would ever agree to give up its nuclear weapons. So my question, since you're an expert in this area, is what do you think would be an incentive for Israel to give up its nuclear weapon so that we could achieve such a goal?
This is a really good question. And the first part of any answer is we don't know because we've never tried anything. Anything. Okay? I mean, to the point where, so the Israeli nuclear structure that they use to make their nuclear weapons material was actually all given to them by France. Right? The French built the reactor and they built the plant for separating out plutonium, etc. And the United States at the time worried about what the Israelis were doing. They said, "What are you guys doing?" And the Israelis said, "Oh, it's a textile factory." I said, "Yeah." And so the Israelis said, "Okay, look, it's a nuclear reactor. It's just for research. We're not doing anything bad." So the Americans said, "Okay, we want to inspect it." And the Israelis said, "Okay, you can come and inspect it." And you think when we talk about inspections in Iran that, there are problems. The Israelis built entire fake walls to cover up doorways and windows, and the inspector would come and there'd just be a wall. They said there's nothing behind it, it's just a wall. And the rest of the facility was hidden behind this brick wall that they would make. And the rest of it was underground and stuff like that. And eventually the Americans figured out what was going on, but they decided not to make an issue out of it because the Israelis were our friends. And so the deal was, we won't talk about it if you don't talk about it. Okay? But everybody knows it's there. Right? And the most recent public estimates by people who follow this reckon the Israelis have of the order of 80 to 100 weapons and material to make a lot more. And they have perfectly good missiles, and they may even have nuclear armed cruise missiles they can fire from submarines. The Germans are selling them submarines that can fire these missiles. But the answer to your question is, apart from President Carter, I don't know of an American president who has ever actually mentioned the phrase Israel's nuclear weapons. Okay? And so until an American political leadership is willing to say, yes, Israel has nuclear weapons and they shouldn't, we can't begin this conversation about what Israel may or may not need in terms of changing its thinking and its discussion about its relationship with nuclear weapons. So, it would be reckless to say this is what it would take because we have no evidence about anything one way or the other. You can project your wishes or fantasies or your fears and make it as easy or as hard as you want, but no one's ever tried anything. So until we're willing to say, okay, we want a nuclear weapon-free zone in the Middle East, the Israelis have to be part of it, we're calling the conference, and yes, Israel has nuclear weapons, and at the end of this, we will have a treaty, and when the Israelis sign it, they will not have nuclear weapons anymore. Once you put that framework out and on the ground and begin diplomacy, then we'll see what it takes. Because then the Israelis are entitled to bargain, just like the Iranians have bargained. Like any country would bargain. I'll say, okay, what do we get for giving this up? Well, in the case of Iran, we lifted sanctions, right? Well, if that's what it takes, then the question is, at some stage, the world may have to think about, well, we'll put sanctions on you if you don't give up your nuclear weapons, right? Everybody else thinks it's a bad idea. So if you want them, you're going to have to pay the price for keeping them. Or it may be to say, okay, the Arabs will make peace with Israel, right? What do the Arabs want to make peace with Israel? The answer is a settlement on Palestine. Okay, so then how do we deal with the settlements issue? Because we don't have this conversation, we don't know which end of the string to start pulling or how to frame the issue properly. But a group of us at Princeton in 2013 wrote a report on a Middle East nuclear weapon-free zone. And what we tried to show was that here's what we think should be in such a treaty, setting up a zone. And here's how we would verify that every country was being honest about it. So we have a good idea of what the treaty should look like, and we have a good idea how to inspect countries to make sure they're keeping their agreement. The question of how to get them to the treaty is something that we don't know because no one has ever even begun that conversation seriously. So I would urge you to write to the White House and ask them this question. You know, what are you guys going to do about this? Because someone has to start, and it's not going to be them.
Question over there. Wait for the mic.
Thanks, Peter. So I'm Ed Aguilar. I'm with the Coalition for Peace Action. We've worked with Zia in Princeton, and very happy to see you here. I wanted to just follow up on what Mary Lou was saying about Senator Ben Cardin, and kind of going back to the technology thing too. You know, we've all been emailing and visiting our senators and Congress people. The other thing we found out with Cory Booker is that he loves Twitter. And he is always on Twitter. He tweets, whatever we call it, more than anyone in public life except possibly Donald Trump. So there was a lot of Twitter traffic, a lot of tweets starting to talk about Cory Booker. And if you wondered why a lot of people thought he was going to wait till like the very last day before the vote, I think one reason that may have speeded him up was he was starting to get a lot of comments about him, some good, some not so good on Twitter. So that was one thing. But the other thing is on the question about Israel. I think it is a very, very good question. But I think rather than simply writing to the White House, because they're going to be too busy in the next year, you know, wrapping things up, I think we need to go to the candidates. We need to go to the town halls, you know, when Hillary Clinton comes to Philadelphia, or Bernie Sanders, or anybody else, Jeb Bush, and raise these questions. And we need to, yes, use Twitter and Facebook and ask them those questions. Thanks.
Mary Day. Yeah, wait for the mic. Just give Peter a workout here.
I'm just wondering, since the US and Iran are both signatories to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, I'm haunted by the question of whether, if we were really implementing and respecting the Non-Proliferation Treaty, would this negotiation have been necessary at all?
No. You're quite right, because the first part of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty says that those countries that don't have nuclear weapons promise never to try to make nuclear weapons, and that we will inspect all of their nuclear activities to make sure they're keeping their promise, so that all their nuclear activities will be completely peaceful. The second part says that countries that are trying to develop nuclear technology for peaceful purposes are entitled to help with nuclear technology from the countries that already have it. And the Iranians have always complained that you guys sanctioned us and boycotted us and wouldn't sell us nuclear technology. And you threatened us. So of course we were going to keep it a secret. And we said, but that means it was a military program. You were trying to make a bomb, because that's how you would make a bomb. And so that was problem part one and part two with how the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty actually played out in this case. But the third part is that the countries that have nuclear weapons, that had them in 1970, had tested them at the time that the treaty entered into force, promised to negotiate to get rid of them. That was 1970. So 45 years have passed. The United States has not kept its side of the bargain. The only thing it had to do was help countries with nuclear technology, and it would as long as they were their friends, which is not in the treaty. The treaty says it doesn't make a distinction between friends and enemies. Okay? But as I told in my story about the Shah, when it was the Shah, we were willing to help. When it wasn't, we weren't, which is a violation of the treaty. But The biggest violation was that it says you will negotiate to get rid of your nuclear weapons. There have never been negotiations for the elimination of nuclear weapons, ever. In the 45-year history of the NPT, the one promise that makes that treaty of great significance is Article 6, that we promise good faith negotiations for the elimination of nuclear weapons. They have failed for 45 years to even begin those negotiations. So yeah, if everybody had been law-abiding and obeyed the treaty in all its elements, we would not have nuclear weapons in the world today, and we would not have had a crisis with Iran. But you know, international treaties are like that.
Oh, okay.
Congress who could not tell you what the NPT is, and that all of the focus on this deal that does not mention the framework of the NPT is allowing that to be buried.
You're quite right. I think that when it comes to things like the Iran deal, there's a bigger politics at play than is there on the surface. Just like there was 20 years ago in the debate over the nuclear test ban treaty. Some of you may remember that. So we've been trying to have a treaty to ban the testing of nuclear weapons ever since the early 1960s, right? So first there was a treaty that banned testing in the atmosphere and in the oceans. And then in 1996, there was a treaty that banned all nuclear weapons testing. President Clinton signed it. It went for ratification to the US Senate. Every single Republican voted against it, which tells you it had nothing to do with the treaty. It had everything to do with President Clinton, just like every single Republican senator is going to vote against this Iran deal, which tells you it has nothing to do with Iran or the deal. It has about the fact that the Republicans will not give the president anything if they can possibly do so, right? So this is the crudest and most scorched earth kind of partisan politics at play. So whether they know about the NPT or not is really, you know, they don't care about that. The biggest thing they want is to make sure the president doesn't get anything that he can actually hold up as an achievement.
Over there. We're trying to balance out the questions and answers here, by the way. There is some method in this.
Thank you for your presentation. You've emphasized several times that a negative aspect of this deal is the fact that Iran's neighbors are now going to have increased access to weapons provided by the U.S. and increased military capacity. Do you envision at all the ability of that happening to serve as a countermeasure for Iran possibly 5 years, 10 years down the road, or if there's a regime change, possibly reneging on the treaty or going back and doing things secretively? Is that a possibility that that could serve as a countermeasure and prevent the escalation of U.S. forces back in the Middle East? And a second part to that question is, Washington politics being what it is, which you just identified, do you feel as a whole that this treaty is worthwhile being passed and getting the measures that the Obama administration needed to get to prevent Republicans voting against it, even with the downside that you've presented to us? Thank you.
Very good. So as I tried to say, the Israelis already have a higher military spending and more military capacity than Iran could possibly imagine. Right? The Iranians are still using weapons systems from the 1970s, whereas the Americans have been giving the Israeli state-of-the-art American fighters and missiles and endless amounts of military aid and assistance. So, and the same is true of the other states in the region who are American allies, like the Saudis and the UAE and so on. as I said, there's $20 billion just since 2009 for Israel, and 120 odd billion dollars for the other Arab states. And there are American military bases in those countries. So the idea that further arming those countries is going to resolve this problem or help resolve this problem is not a convincing argument. In terms of asking, will it reduce the risk of the Americans having to send military forces into the region? What you're basically then saying is that, are we going to arm the other Middle East countries so they can fight Iran themselves without needing American soldiers to do so, just as long as we send them American guns and money? Okay? Well, what's it to do with us if we're not willing to fight our own wars? Either you're treating them like mercenaries, we want somebody to fight the Iranians, here's guns and money, fight them, or they have their own quarrels, we're not interested in resolving those quarrels, we'll just send them guns and money, make profit, and watch them fight, and not do anything when it happens. Any way you play this out, it becomes a very problematic scenario. And I think that the biggest issue of all that you have to worry about is that the Saudis and some of the Arab states, and certainly Iran, have lots of reasons to disagree about many things. Religious reasons, political reasons, fights about oil and who controls what share of the oil market, and so on. And the Israelis have their own reasons to have issues with the Iranians, including former Iranian leaders who talked about destroying Israel and wiping them off the map and things like that. And so everybody has good reason. But what you don't do in a region where there are grievous disputes is to fuel the fire in this way, because as I try to argue, it becomes very hard now for Iranian political leadership not to accept demands from their generals for more military spending and a more militarized foreign policy in the region, which only makes everything worse, not better. And so ultimately the question becomes, if we want the people of the Middle East to solve their own disputes, then we should just leave them alone. If we're not willing to invest in helping them find a settlement, then we shouldn't make it worse. I think that's the real choice that we have to confront. Either be part of the solution or stop making their problems worse. The second question about, is the deal worth it despite all of these issues? Yeah, absolutely it's worth it. Of course it's worth it. I mean, diplomacy that can deliver an agreement of this magnitude on something that is so important, where everybody had such enormous stakes. I mean, as I said, the Israelis were willing to kill Iranian scientists. The US was willing to use cyber war against another country, right? The Iranians were willing to sacrifice their own economic and social well-being to have this nuclear program. The fact that this didn't end in war is an enormous achievement and something to be celebrated and to be supported. But like so many other things in life, now you have it, now you have to make the best out of it that you can and not let the worst of it overwhelm the good.
Over there. Right there with the hand up.
This has been a very good talk. I'd like to change the emphasis a little bit. I've spent some 30-some years working on the peaceful uses of nuclear energy at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. One of the goals there was, of course, to supplant fossil fuels with nuclear energy. And I would like you to speak to that topic.
when nuclear power, so let me begin at the beginning. It's always the best way. So during the atomic bomb program and during World War II, the scientists that were building the bomb wanted something good to come out of this, right? You don't want your life's work basically to be a bomb that destroys entire cities and nothing good to come out of it. So ideas for nuclear power reactors as a peaceful application of nuclear energy were discussed from the very beginning. It's just that nobody knew how to do it or how economic it would be or what the other issues involved in it would be. And so we've been trying for a long time. And there was a big rush to nuclear energy in the 1970s. The US ended up with 100 nuclear power reactors, which is about a quarter of all the nuclear power reactors in the whole world. The French built a lot, the Soviets built a lot, the Japanese built a lot. And as time has passed, the rate of building has gone down as we've had to put in more and more safety and regulatory mechanisms, because we realized that the technology is enormously complex and enormously risky. And when things go wrong, they go really badly wrong. And there's a whole school of thought that believes that when you have complicated technologies and people together, accidents will happen. I mean, sometimes even simple technology and people and accidents will happen. But when you have complicated technologies and people, accidents will happen. Nobody wants it to, but the systems are so complicated and people are people, things go wrong that nobody imagined could go wrong. They're called normal accidents. Right? That just happens. It's not a freak, it's not unexpected, it's just like it rains. It's part of weather. Accidents are just part of living with complicated technologies. And you know, there's a joke that one could make that you could imagine building a foolproof nuclear reactor. The problem is most people are not fools. So they're smarter than, they try things that they shouldn't, so, which is what happened in Chernobyl, the guys who were running the reactor. Anyway, the long and the short of it is that over time, we've realized that this is a very complicated technology, which we have a hard time managing, and people don't like these kinds of high-tech risks, which have catastrophic possible consequences. So public support for nuclear energy as, a clean, safe, cheap source of energy for the future has waned. There's a lot of suspicion, and people are risk averse. And it depends on whether you're a man or a woman, it turns out. When you do polling, more men are sympathetic to nuclear energy than women. Young people are less supportive of nuclear energy than older people. So there's a whole set of things that are going on. And as we've taken the turn towards a more environmentally informed sensibility and worry more about climate change and other things, I think that the center of gravity of thinking about energy and the future has moved past nuclear energy now. I think in most places, most of the time, except where policy making is dominated by big utilities who can override the public interest, or by governments that are still in love with high-tech things that only governments can do, like in China or India, then sure, they will build lots of nuclear power, which is what's happening in China and India. But in lots of other places, people are saying enough. So the old ones are being run down. In some countries like Germany, they're actually just being shut, even though they could run for many years longer. And new ones are scarce. So you can see that there will be a slow decline in most countries in the West. And once the Chinese and the Indians get over this first enthusiasm of having nuclear energy and they start to deal with having their own accidents and their own problems, and they get their own environmentalists and they get their own nuclear regulators and stuff happens, then we'll see what happens with them. But I think that the idea of having a large nuclear future, I think that moment has probably passed now. And the Iran deal, if anything, has taught the world that even a small nuclear program like Iran's becomes such a big concern when it comes to proliferation that we should think about that also in thinking about the future of nuclear energy. I mean, right now, Iran has one nuclear power reactor making electricity, and have a few thousand centrifuges. If they had a commercial nuclear power program with lots of reactors and lots of uranium enrichment, like they want 15, 20 years from now, then you have real worries about, what could they do if they ever decided to make a nuclear weapon. And so that is a concern that I think has settled in more and more people's minds. So I think on balance, the trend is probably that where it's not being blocked by vested interests or being supported by governments and nuclear establishments who have no checks and balances, nuclear power is probably on the wane in most places.
Questions? Over here.
When you mentioned lifting of sanctions before, you seem to indicate that the only or at least main benefit would be to the hardliners. Do you envision any kind of a scenario where it would lead to broader prosperity that might facilitate social and political change on a important level in Iran?
This is, again, a terrific question. This is what one would have liked to see the argument being made. That yes, we're lifting the sanctions because we want the Iranians to have a sense of well-being. We want Iran and its people to feel that belonging in the international community is something that is good for them and good for the rest of the world, right? That we want Iran to be open to tourism and trade and intellectual exchange and to be part of the normal human community in the world that we have today, and that lifting sanctions makes that possible. And as time passes, the next generation of Americans and Iranians will feel at home with each other, and all this stuff will be in the past. And then why would they ever want to be hostile or make weapons? But that's not an argument that we've heard from the administration. Peace movement people have made this argument about sanctions. The president of Iran and his political circle, they want to lift sanctions because that's why they were elected. Their election campaign is, look, we're going to do a deal with the world about this nuclear nonsense, lift sanctions and boost our economy and put people back to work and, raise everybody's living standards and, let people in Iran breathe freely. And I think they still want to do that. My concern is that if we're going to be pouring money and weapons into the neighborhood, the Iranian generals are going to say, look, why are you building schools and roads and hospitals and factories? They're buying warships. We need warships. Right? And so that's the political struggle that I see we are setting up in Iran, which we didn't need to. But my hope is still that the Iranian leadership will have the good sense to tell their generals, well, let them have their warships. If they want to go down that road with American money, fine. We are going to focus on our economy and our well-being because that's the kind of people that we want to be. And one could hope that enlightened political leadership can actually do that. We all believed in hope and change once. And so, so I'll stop there.
Two more questions over here.
Hi, Zia. Anyway, thank you. I'm Diane Perlman. I'm from Philly, visiting now, and I live in DC now. And I observed 12 hours of the hearings, and I followed Ben Cardin into the elevator after the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and asked him if he'd have a hearing with people in the field of conflict resolution, conflict transformation, and the deal. And I've been in touch with his office, and they haven't called me back. Also, I just want to say I'm also originally with Psychologists for Social Responsibility. Years ago, we had PRONAC here, and I wrote a statement edited down by the steering committee. So on the Psychologists for Social PSYSR website, there's a statement, and also talking about manipulation of fear and exaggeration of enemy imaging. And my question relates sort of to the last one, but I'm really horrified at the Democrats. Like they're so bad. I mean, they're good at answering the questions factually, but I think of the line from Yeats that the best lack all conviction and the worst are full of passionate intensity. So from a sort of a psychological communication, that the people against it are clear, coherent, emotional, unified, easy to understand. And the Democrats, whether they're like confusing and they don't make sense, and they agree with all the arguments that the people who are against it say, yes, they're terrorists, and yes, they're evil, and yes, they're going to cheat, and yes, like I don't know how they would convince anyone. And from social science point of view, you would predict that the deal would have a moderating effect, and it's already having, opening embassy in UK and business people, and 60% of the population under 35 are on Facebook and Twitter and want to be part of the world. But like, no, I think the Democrats are afraid.
Is there a question?
Yeah, well, just about that. And I mean, there's probably not time, but also I wanted you to mention about the 2010 agreement with Turkey and Brazil that Hillary dissed in the timeline. But
okay, so let me take exception with you on one thing. You said the Democrats are terrible. I don't think so. I think that we can see this in a different way. And the different way is this, that they are politicians. And in the American political system, if you are in office, you are wondering about your re-election. And the fact of the matter is, and we know this, that the pressures that have been brought to bear on the Democrats reflect the conflicts in their constituencies and in their political support. The Republicans don't have these conflicts, right? You try being a peace movement activist going to talk to a Republican from Arizona. Yeah, you just try it. I mean, my heart always goes out to our friends and who try and do this. But the fact of the matter is that when you look at the ones who are on the East Coast, for example, in New Jersey, you saw, so Senator Menendez, right, votes no. Senator Booker, to his credit, votes yes. And the issue comes down to the fact that, they have a lot of pressure from people who fund their campaigns. And the peace movement is not rich. We do not fund campaigns in millions of dollars. I mean, Bernie gets, checks for 10s and 20s and, a few hundred if he's lucky. But we don't fund big campaigns like some of the supporters of Senator Menendez and Senator Booker and others do. And money talks. I mean, they are realist politicians. They have to figure out, well, I'm supposed to have other constituencies to serve. I'm in this not just for the Iran deal. I also care about prisons and, homelessness and the rights of women and, education and, public transport and all of these things. Are they supposed to sacrifice everything for one vote? They didn't come into politics to do a life or death vote on Iran. That wasn't something they ever imagined having to do. So you have to be fair. If anybody has failed, and this will be a harsh judgment, so forgive me, we have. Right? We put in place elected officials and hold them to a standard that we have not managed to convince our fellow citizens to support. And if we can't get our fellow citizens to agree with us on these fundamental questions of war and peace and the use of force by the United States in the world, then what is an elected representative supposed to do? Represent just the peace movement? They'd never get elected if they did that. Right? So the real failure here is that we have failed to build the communities of peace and justice that we want so badly. And we can't hold our elected officials responsible for our failure.
One more question? behind the green shirt. Wait for the mic.
Thank you. You mentioned that Israel is getting these billions of dollars for militarization, basically, including, I guess, in effect, to fund the Gaza war last year. With all those billions, why is Netanyahu so opposed to this deal?
I was actually surprised why this wasn't the first question. Perhaps it would have been if I had asked you first. So this has actually been one of the really interesting ways of learning something about politics. This deal has been fascinating for students of politics. And so I can commend, if you haven't read it already, some of you may have, Noam Chomsky has this great essay in The Nation, which you should read, about the Iran deal and these kinds of things. And so and he was actually on the faculty at MIT when they had the Iranians coming. Well, he mentions it in his article also. But, it's one of the things I think I understand after watching this whole deal play out is that from the point of view of Netanyahu and the political fraction that he represents in Israel, they don't want a war with Iran, but they don't want a peace between the United States and Iran either. Right? What they want is Iran to be in this box, sanctioned, penalized, punished, beaten up, right? So it stays out of the power politics of the region. And opposing the deal so far has come at no cost to him at all. Right? I mean, imagine a different scenario where, the Democrats had brought Hugo Chavez to Congress to speak, right? Can you imagine the Republican riot that would take place, right? But he could do it because he knows that he has rock solid support on the Republican side and enough on the Democrat side because it's Israel. No one in the American political system will seriously talk about imposing sanctions or punishing Netanyahu for this direct interference in the democratic process in the United States. No one will punish him. So what was there to lose, right? He looks good at home. He whips up his support base. It turns out he gets more military aid than before. So what was the downside in opposing? From the political calculus that he has, we say rude things about him, and so what? And, in the long term, I think actually there are problems. And some of you may have seen the coverage in the New York Times, but, talking to my friends who are members of the peace community and also and are also Jewish, I know how much grief there has been within the community with, friends and families and, communities of faith fighting among themselves about how to understand this deal and what it means and what are the right set of principles and how to think about this. And, when you read in the newspaper about, members of the Jewish community accusing each other of being traitors or of being, supporting the Holocaust that might come, etc., you think, this is a terrible price for a community to pay because of Netanyahu's political interests. And so, hey, that's very sad and it shouldn't happen. But beyond a certain point, he doesn't care, is my conclusion, right? This was all purely instrumental. He sees this in terms of hard power politics about his power in Israel and using the United States as an instrument of Israeli national security policy. And in that, he is winning.
Well, thank you very much.